Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to our Meet the Immigrant Entrepreneurs event, a speaker series in partnership with Immigrants Rising. We are very excited to have you joining us again today. My name is Nicole Wesley, Senior Program Manager of Career Supports at TheDream.Us. Before we begin, I have a few brief announcements to share. First of all, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. State your name, major, the college you're attending. Also, feel free to include your LinkedIn URL. It's a great way for you to network and connect with scholars and alumni across the country. For today's event, this is a Zoom webinar, so please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that you'll have for the panelists, and use the chat feature for all other communication. All sessions will be recorded and posted to the TheDream.Us YouTube channel. And lastly, please know that all information provided during today's session is for educational purposes only. Information shared is not legal advice. I want to also briefly mention our ITIN website, as ITINs can be a powerful tool for those who are not eligible for a Social Security number. An ITIN is an individual taxpayer identification number that is issued by the IRS. ITINs can be used to file and pay taxes, open a bank account, apply for an EIN, and pursue entrepreneurial career opportunities through independent contracting, freelancing, and starting a business. For more information on ITINs, check out our ITIN website, where you can access 3 helpful guides that we've created, as well as our ITIN YouTube playlist. You can also find a link to Immigrants Rising's ITIN guide at the bottom of our ITIN webpage as well. As a reminder, our Meet the Immigrant Entrepreneurs Speaker Series continues this week and next. All events are 90 minutes in length and start at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please make sure to adjust for your own time zone. Also know that each session has its own separate, unique Zoom link, so make sure you're clicking on the right one. Our next session will be this Friday, November 10th, with a focus on public and social services. So we hope to see everyone there as well. And now, we'll kick off today's session with a focus on education. I'll turn it over to our colleagues at Immigrants Rising to take it from here.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome everyone. We are super honored to be here in this space with all of you and to have this partnership with TheDream.Us. My name is Rocio Preciado, and I'm the Director of Mental Health and Career Services at Immigrants Rising. And like many of you and many of the people that you might know and people who we get to work with every day, I was undocumented. I was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I came to the U.S. at the age of 9. And there are 2 things that my parents shared with me when I first came to the U.S. One of them was never share your immigration status with anyone. And second, your only responsibility is to do well in school. Why? Because I did not have work authorization and I was not able to work. And that became my sole purpose, to do well in school until it was time for me to go to college, and realize that I wasn't sure how I was going to be able to earn income after graduating college. And one of the biggest questions that people shared and a lot of the challenges that came, sometimes even from relatives, was, what is the purpose of going to college and putting in all the work if you're not going to be able to work? And we're here today to connect you with a lot of information, resources, and people who have gone through the journey and the process of identifying opportunities, creating opportunities, and tapping into their full potential to create something to generate income independent of their immigration status. And I'm very honored to be part again of this panel session with amazing people who have not just learned and received the information on how to make this happen, but have actually walked through the process and the journey of making this happen. When I graduated from UC Santa Cruz in 2013, which feels like it was a very long time ago, I was still undocumented. And one of the first things that came to mind was, what am I going to do? Because I need to survive. I ended up working at the flea market, and there were many questions that came to mind in terms of like, how am I utilizing my degree and my knowledge and my expertise while working at the flea market? I was able to identify so many different talents and skills through that journey, and able to connect to resources like our Life After College guide, which allowed me to learn about independent contracting options. And I'm really excited to know that there are people who, like I said, have gone through that process, have gone through that journey of identifying those opportunities for themselves. And I am now not only a staff member at Immigrants Rising, but I have learned that entrepreneurship has been a pathway to really empower and bring a lot of resiliency and agency into my life. And so I'm really looking forward to you all learning more about experts and people who are navigating this process, and people who you can connect to as you begin to ask yourself, what does life after college look like for you? And so this is just the continuation of work that we've been doing for the last 17 years at Immigrants Rising, with a focus and an emphasis on making sure that people are able to thrive and pursue education and careers independent of their immigration status. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Danae to share a little bit more about her journey and her process. And even possibly, Danae, if you want to share if you had a first encounter with entrepreneurship in your life.
Thank you so much, Rocio. Hi, everyone. My name is Danae Joseph. I am the National Entrepreneurship Manager over at Immigrants Rising, and I'm honored to be the program manager that's leading much of the efforts between TheDream.Us and IR. And I thought something that is incredibly fantastic is now the opportunity to bring together scholars to learn more about entrepreneurship. TheDream.Us has an enormous network of scholars, and IR, like Rocio says, has the 17 years of expertise in being able to help people regardless of status. And one of the things that I hold near and dear as someone who is documented from Belize, Central America, I immigrated here at the age of 7 years old without my mother, father, or siblings. I was raised by my maternal grandmother. And so that experience really informed much of my undocumented hustle, right? Because for us, it's not just about survival, it's about being able to thrive. Who wants to simply be a part of that tragic immigrant narrative that the media likes to perpetuate? I'm not sure about y'all, but I like to be fabulous, honey. So that tragic narrative does not work for me. And so that's why we're really coming together in this space. And I'm honored to be in a position to work with fantastic people and to be able to bring on board fantastic people like Juan Ruiz and Charlene to have this conversation, because I know you all are going to get a world of insight. So what you're into today, we're actually going to do introductions of these two fantastic individuals. Then we're going to allow them some time to do a share out of their own immigration journeys and stories, navigating their own undocu hustle before we go into a conversation moderated by myself. And then we want audience participation. Right? We want you all to be a part of this conversation just like they are. And we want you to ask those pressing questions, right? There is no such thing as a dumb question. Anything that you think is relevant and comes up at the top of your head, make sure to ask it in the ask function or the Q&A function of this webinar. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the fantastic individuals that we have. We have Juan Ruiz, who is the owner of Nepantla Philosophy LLC. Juan Ruiz, a non-documented immigrant from Tijuana, Mexico, launched Nepantla Philosophy LLC to nurture equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education through programming, professional training, and consulting. He's a second-year PhD student in the Latin American and Latino Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. Juan works on cultivating resources for undocumented students, theorizing about the undocumented lived experiences, and respecting, valuing, and enjoying all forms of people of color livingness. When not engaging academically, he loves playing soccer, swimming in open waters, and hiking through the forest on a rainy day. And Charlene Acheng. Charlene Acheng is an undocumented Black immigrant with an extensive background advocating for expansion of resources for undocumented students. She also has experience coordinating advocacy campaigns that raise awareness of the plight of Black immigrants through community outreach and coalition building. Charlene strives to highlight the experience of living while Black and undocumented by sharing her narrative through oral engagement. And as someone impacted by the unjust immigration system, her passion for immigration justice continues to fuel her drive. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Juan Ruiz and Charlene Acheng, and we're going to get started with Juan Ruiz to do a share out.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for the invitation to address your students. My name is Juan Ruiz. I use him, he, él pronouns. I'm bicultural, bilingual in Spanish and English. So I welcome questions, comments in either of those languages. And I was asked to mention my encounter with entrepreneurship. If we just glimpse on that briefly. I think I've been an entrepreneur since I was a kid. There were informal engagements where you charged to do something or a chore per hour, or whatever, a little project, but it transfers into something more professional. When I was in the university and I was figuring out how to pay for my graduate program, that I got an independent contractor gig at UC Santa Cruz. And then there was a process in how that became just an independent contractor gig to launching a limited liability company so that I could be recognized as a business entity. And I could talk more about that later.
Thank you so much, Juan. How about you, Charlene?
Hi, everyone. So nice to be here and share space with you. My name is Charlene, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm originally from Nairobi, Kenya, which is in East Africa, and I came to this country when I was 12 years old. So this is my 13th year here. And for me, I was never interested in entrepreneurship or business ownership. It's something that I had to navigate because I don't have DACA. And I didn't even know what DACA was until I got into college. So when I got into college, I was fortunate, and I went to UC Irvine. But shout out to UC Santa Cruz. I heard UC Santa Cruz mentioned twice. They do a lot of organizing there. So I wanted to do a shout out for the campus. But I luckily when I got into UC Irvine, we at least had an undocumented student coordinator. So we didn't have a space yet, but at least we had a coordinator, and she was a very intentional coordinator. I was very fortunate enough that she hit the ground running by making sure she implemented resources for students. And one of those resources was Dream Scholars, which is a program where undocumented freshmen were allowed to integrate into the four-year institution by being paired up with an upperclassman undocumented mentor who's in the same field. And then we also had weekly seminars. So through that class is when I even learned undocumented was a term, because the terminology I used to use was, oh, I'm here without papers. I'm here without papers. And, I think similar to Rocio, my mom just told me, oh, you can't tell anyone that, especially being Black, because of the higher risk associated with being criminalized just because of your Blackness. She just said, like, don't regurgitate that information to anyone. Just keep that to yourself. So I knew I was undocumented in high school, but I didn't really know what that meant until college. And it didn't really hit me until the end of my freshman year, because that's when everybody was applying to different internships and opportunities on campus. And I was unable to participate. And in the cohort I was in, I think I was the only non-DACA. There was only 2 non-DACA. So majority of the cohort was documented. So again, I came into college when DACA was very big. I think now we're having more conversations about majority of college incoming graduates not being, or incoming college students not being documented. But at the time, it was not a big discussion. So I knew early on from my second year that I would have to find creative ways to get professional development in campus, and also be able to get paid. Because that financial aspect is what's really important, especially for somebody who doesn't have DACA, who relies on the campus for work opportunities and doesn't want to resort to going off campus. But it was through a whole process, which I can explain later as we get into it, but having to mobilize students who were non-DACA in my campus and let them know that we don't have any resources, because even the resources available at the time for undocumented students geared towards documented students. So there was no sight in mind or any thought about what is going on with non-DACA students. And eventually, when we did transition into a center, which was by my third year, so my first year, we only had a coordinator, but eventually my third year, we had a center, which was helpful because now we had the infrastructure to mobilize and demand resources. But even then, when you looked at the student staff, it was all documented. There was no space for non-DACA. I was the only non-DACA, and the only reason I was even able to work at the Dream Center and Undocumented Student Services at the time is because I did it through a third party fellowship. So this fellowship wasn't paid. It wasn't paid, but they were like, oh, we'll do weekly seminars where we bring in different, business or an entrepreneur to help you better learn that stuff. So that was helpful. And then we also got credits, so 1.3 credits for like units for classes, but there was no payment aspect to it. So I think during that experience, I was very bitter because I was like, I was doing a lot for the Dream Center, I'm doing a lot to support other undocumented students, being a visible face, especially being the only Black person within that space. But it was really helpful because it was because of that entrepreneurship course that I realized, like, oh my God, there's already spaces on campus that have fellowships. And if this already exists, even though it was in isolation, I think it was within a specific department. But I was like, if they have fellowships, then how come our own undocumented services doesn't have fellowships? They, more than anyone, should be doing the work to establish that within our space, because we especially have those students who need that. So that was kind of like my inception of realizing, like, oh my goodness, I don't have DACA, I don't have a social, so I'm going to have to find loopholes of not only getting professional development, because that was the big thing too, like we needed professional development, but also making sure that we were getting paid simultaneously. So just a little bit of a background, but
That's amazing. I think one of the overlap that I heard almost immediately is how identity really led to you all having to advocate for yourselves in unique ways across your college campuses. So for one, you shared a little bit more about how you started your own LLC, but before that, how you became a contractor for the university. Can you speak a little bit more about how you were able to navigate that? And how did you advocate for yourself from the lens of a student perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I was the first to be admitted into the philosophy department master's program at UC Santa Cruz who was undocumented. And there was no financial aid for a master's student. And the UC system, or UC Santa Cruz particularly, trails far behind in creating inclusive fellowship for grad students who don't have work authorization, or even at the master's level, for a variety of reasons, right? But I saw that there was a need for an internship or a fellowship to pay for my program. And there was also an unmet student need of awareness of how do you navigate grad school when you're undocumented, all aspects of it, the application process, grad school life, financial aid options. And so then I went directly to a person who I knew that was very supportive of undocumented students, had a leadership role at the education opportunity programs at UCSC. And I prepared a proposal and I said, there's an unmet student need. I can provide a lot of this work because I've already navigated it. And so how about I do some mentorship, a set of workshops and presentations, and just like I need support in paying for my program. And so then they were able to provide me with a stipend, tuition, and fees covered. And it's common for grad students to have healthcare. And so then I basically like had all the support I needed just to focus on my studies. And eventually we were able to institutionalize that internship project. We had another grad student mentor when I graduated from my program. And so it was great to like create a model that other folks could mimic and that served someone else who was from a different discipline, a different walk of life. But it was a lot of I can do it, invest in me. I see there's an unmet need. I can bring this to the table. And after that, that like just allowed to build a relationship that later I knew, talking to the right folks, presenting it in such a way you could continue to open doors and engage in business. And so then that led to independent contracting, and then launching a business venture, teaching about entrepreneurship and grad school workshops, and then just like the rest. It's like now I'm in a grad program, like it's just continues evolving as you go.
Juan, you definitely need to teach a master class in advocacy. The fact that you were able to get tuition, a stipend, like, and you got a permanent role for someone else to be able to follow in that similar path, like that's a huge testament to the power of advocacy. And Shirlene, I heard you say something similar to Juan, which is that you recognize an unmet need, right? You as a student saw that the university was providing opportunities for certain subgroups of students, but you saw that the community in which needed it the most, the undocumented community, did not have the same option. So what did you do immediately after you recognized that unmet need? Did you do something similar to Juan in identifying who that key person was to talk to? If you could just walk us through your process of advocacy.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we have a lot of similarities with Juan, but shout out to you and all the work that you did. I'm so glad you're in your program, hopefully finishing strong.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think similarly for me, I was so lucky because I came into college when there was already a set of undocumented leaders who were very radicalized. And the reason they were is because they were intentional about taking African American studies courses. And they were very radicalized by the AFM department in terms of racial consciousness and political consciousness. So they really integrated that into their organizing. And so when I met them, I was still very like green to political consciousness. And they really were the ones who were like, you better take this AFM professor, you better take this teacher, they'll teach you this and this. But it shows because I think it was very groundbreaking the way they would analyze things and think about things that I wouldn't think about that way. Because initially, when I had talked to the director of the center, this is the end of my second year after I've done the fellowship that wasn't paid, but I still wanted to work there. So I was like, okay, the third year is coming up. I want to get paid. What does this look like? And his response was very political. It was just more like, oh, you know, for me to hire you, I would kind of have to fire like 4 other students who are kind of like on payroll, because I guess that was the excuse, they're on work study. So they get a certain percentage cut from the school. So the center doesn't pay the full amount because the school covers a certain amount. And so his reasoning was like, oh, well, for me to hire you fully and pay you and fund you fully, they would have to go. And I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense. Because I was naive at the time. I didn't really deeply think about it. But I was so lucky that I had other undocumented organizers who I talked to about this, and they, you know, helped me realize how appalling it was for him to respond that way instead of trying to come up with creative solutions for me to be able to work there, especially after a whole year. And they were doing a review of how great my services were, like all these things that I was doing, interacting with students. And so they empowered me like, oh, we're gonna have a meeting and we'll be there to support you and we'll hold them accountable. And that meeting is what resulted in us coming up with like, what are you doing for non-DACA students? You know, it's been a year, you've been in this position, there's nothing happening. And it was helpful because I had also other non-DACA students come and share the experiences of like the challenges it is accessing resources at the center, all these things. So it was a lot of self-empowerment, which again came from other students who had already been doing the work and they knew how to navigate the political like issues that comes with higher education. And I was able to have that meeting with them. And I think one thing I realized is like educators don't even know what they don't know. Like a lot of administrators are so disconnected from what's happening in their departments that they need you to give them the solutions and the blueprint of like, what do I need to do? Which is crazy because it's like, this is your job. But I understood that they were not going to do it unless you push them to do it. And I think one thing that was effective was mobilizing other non-DACA students, them sharing the experiences of like, I can't even, stay on campus because I can't afford to live on campus. I'm struggling to come to classes because I don't have money for gas. I have to choose between eating versus, going to classes. And it was just really disheartening. And I was like, we need to make sure administrators hear these stories. But beyond that, also coming with the statistics. And at the time I knew because we had the highest number of undocumented students out of all the UC campuses. So that was a great statistic that we always use. Like, we have the highest number of undocumented students. Majority of those are non-DACA. We're accepting a lot of undocumented students, which is great. It looks good for the campus, but you're not having any resources to sustain them and make sure that they actually graduate. And so it was interesting because a lot of the pushback was like, oh, well, is this really legal? Can we really do this? But what's funny is the fellowship that I was doing was funded by UCOP. So that's UC Office of the President. And all the other UCs are under that office. So it's like if UCOP has sponsored a fellowship model that pays me through stipends through my financial aid, why are other departments on campuses not able to do this? And it was hard for them to talk about. It's like, well, obviously UCOP can do it, then we just need the finances. So finances now was the issue. And we had to meet with the deans of different departments, different key stakeholders, the directors of different resource centers like the Black Center, the Undocumented Center, Women's Center, and really ask them, like, if you're intentional about supporting undocumented students, you need to put money aside to sponsor a fellow for at least a year within your department. Because the main issue was like, we don't all want to work within undocumented student services. No offense to undocumented services, but that's what a lot of students are limited to when you don't have any other spaces on campus that are undocumented inclusive of your status. And so our goal was making sure not only are we tapped into the different student affairs resources, but also academic units. So that's why we met with the deans, explained our stories to them, asked them if they could commit funding to make sure that they could host a student for a whole year and not only give them the financial compensation they need, but also make sure that they also getting professional development. Because if you want to go to grad school, one thing you need is professional development. And if you're not able to accrue that, then how do you even do that? So that was really helpful. And I remember the time I was pre-med. So again, there was no sight for me going to medical school once I graduated because you need at least DACA to even be able to apply. Like, you can't just do it without DACA. But in my head, I was like, but I still need to get professional development within the School of Medicine. They don't have any fellowships or internships. Like, what do I do? And it was beautiful because through this fellowship, the School of Medicine was able to sign off as a host site. And that's how I was able to intern with them my senior year and be in the dean's office and kind of learn how like the admissions works and the in and out of the School of Medicine. But that experience would not have been possible if I didn't go out and like search for it. So I think that was the crazy part, is realizing like we are creating our own opportunities ourselves. Like, all the professional development that I did in creating that fellowship is the skills that ended up reflecting post-grad when I was navigating organizing on a national scale. So, yeah.
That is amazing. Really another testament to the power of advocacy. But I think something that both of you touched on was the importance of non-DACA conversations and centering resources for a community that is oftentimes underrepresented, especially within institutional and bureaucratic settings, right? Because oftentimes folks want to focus on the individuals who have some sort of status, and they'll leave the non-documented people behind. So what advice would you give to non-documented students right now, right? Because these are the communities that we're speaking to who are a part of this webinar. What advice would you give to them? Because unfortunately, the reality is many institutions are still focused on just maintaining DACA. And as a DACA recipient, I want to say that, of course, that's important, but also what else, right? DACA was meant to be a temporary solution to a long-standing problem. So how can colleges and universities better advocate for non-documented people? And then what advice would you give to the non-documented students who are part of this conversation?
That is a great question, urgent, pressing, and I think there was a mention in the chat right here about knowing your worth and advocating for yourself. I think that you have to always maintain and know your worth. Know that there are folks who are willing to support. Unfortunately, it requires us to do a little bit of like clarification work and reminding folks undocumented or DACA, like there's a spectrum of differences, of just nuances that exist. And just reminding folks, the fact that you have DACA doesn't mean that everyone who's undocumented has DACA. There's different forms of undocumentedness. And knowing that you might have to do this work, you might have to do some of this clarificatory work, but to the right folks who might have resources to support you, it is necessary to bring it up, because you might want to identify, and this is a piece of advice I followed, identifying a champion or a leader at an institution who is willing to support you, who is willing to advocate for you or just listen to you. And maybe it's important to find someone like that, remind them undocumented and DACA is not the same thing. There's nuances we have to account for. We can't just disregard these particular stories and identities. And so remind folks that if they're in a position of administration, they might have a duty to know this. And so then respectfully bringing it to their awareness, that because you are worthy of being there, because you can take research or institutional incentives to another level, it's worthy for them to listen to you and for you to advocate for these singularities, these particular identities that are important. So I think I would sum it up like that: identifying a champion, making sure that your worth, you have to be your best coach and your best player. Sometimes you have to advocate for yourself, and that does not mean that you are not doing it with the community in mind. It just means that you might be in that position where you have to do it for yourself, and it opens the doors for others. What do you think, Charlene?
Yeah, I definitely echo everything you said, especially knowing your worth. I think that more than anything, if there's nothing you take away from today, is that, because people can easily take advantage of, you know, your lack of sense of self. So I think that is key. And I think for sure also getting allies. I think for me, what was the biggest support is community building. And that's something that I'm just so grateful that there was at least foundations of it by the time I got to college. So if that doesn't exist for you, then how can you build that community, you know? Because it was through the undocumented student group that we were able to carry out a lot of this work. And the only reason they took us seriously is because we had a legitimized group that we were communicating from, and our needs and our wants, and also forming coalition with other student groups who are also going through the same thing, like Black Student Union, the Latinx groups on campus, because they've already experienced years of pushback from administrators. So learning from them, like what has been effective in the past. And I think we forget a lot how student power is literally the main reason we have half the resources we have on our spaces. If there's any like Black Resource Center, Undocumented Center, food basic needs, it came from student advocacy. It did not come out of the goodness and kindness of administrators' hearts. They don't usually just think about, oh, what need is lacking? Let me just give it to students. Like it usually stems from students heavily advocating for that resource. And a lot of them don't even get to live to enjoy those resources. You know, they graduate before they even see them come to fruition, which is why I'm grateful I was able to experience mine. But I think I understand that even the fact that I was able to go to college as an undocumented student, get financial aid, is because of the advocacy that undocumented youth did here in California for the California DREAM Act to pass and all these other things. So like, what can I do within my capacity to extend those resources to incoming undocumented youth? Because I came in with something already available. So how do you push that envelope and making sure that you are leaving the campus in a way that you didn't find it? And like, again, it's unfortunate that you do have to do that advocacy work, but really remembering that these academic institutions were not meant for us. You know, we're not even supposed to be in them. The fact that you infiltrated them is a testament in itself. So, and and also remembering, again, knowing your worth goes back to the idea of like the university is responsible for sustaining you with all the resources you need to graduate. As soon as they accept you into the institution, it is on them to make sure that you have the resources you need to matriculate, because that's the most important thing, making sure you graduate, the graduation rates. But it's like, I can't do that if I don't have the resources. So if the resources are lacking, then it's on you to demand them. And a great way to do that is through community building, because the work can be very strenuous. You can experience burnout. You can sometimes be failing academically, really struggling. And the only way you can sustain that is by having other community members of folks who understand the same struggle, who are going through the same thing, who have the same willpower, you know, and vision for the long-term implications of the work that you're doing. So community building would be my big one. And if it doesn't exist, then you can be the one to sustain that, you know, because to create a student organization, I think it takes what, 2-3 people, maybe different campuses. But that in itself is a start to establish to the campus that we are here, we exist. You may not know of us, but you will know of us soon enough. And by the time you graduate, this, you know, the organization is going to be bigger and bigger and sustain itself. But at least now students will have a foundation of a way to protect themselves, because the academy is not our friends, unfortunately. And again, that's not to say, again, don't reach out to allies within administrators. You can and definitely should, but really being strategic about how you engage with them, and also knowing the limits of their power, you know, because there's only so much some student staff members can do. And also there's only so much that coordinators can do, as opposed to a dean of a school. But of how you approach a dean of a school, because their priorities are very misaligned with students and more aligned with the university. It has to be very technical, political. So it sucks. So you have to play the game, but that is the only language that they understand. So you just have to be really intentional about your approach. But I think the best way to sustain that is by having community to make sure that work doesn't die, even if you graduate and you don't see the fruition of it.
Two of you hit on something phenomenal. So the first thing that stood out was the need for cross-campus solidarity and ensuring that there's continuity no matter which class of students graduate, right? Speak more on that. How does one sustain cross-campus solidarity? And I say that as someone who graduated from UCLA, who we had to do a lot of organizing in order to actualize the realities that we wanted, because in a lot of ways they could just wait you out. They'll wait that 4 years or that 5 years if you're taking a 5th year, and they will purposefully wait for the leadership to leave. So how do you build community in a way to ensure sustainability? And then to you, Juan, something that I also heard is that the educators, right, those who are in positions of power often don't know what they don't know, right? And so there's often an education process of the educators, right? So I want you two to hit on those individual topics. So Charlene, I want you to hit on how do we go ahead and expand upon cross-campus solidarity? And then Juan, I would love for you to speak about how do you go about navigating conversations with those who should be educated enough to already know the answers but do not? And how do you hold them to account to actually prevail in getting community what we need?
All right, great questions. One piece of advice that always helped me in speaking to folks who are in spaces that can enact change is to remember to take the higher road, to be courteous and respectful. One can be confrontational and protest without having to be disrespectful. It's a means of sophisticating the methods, right? Turning. I'm gonna throw a little bit of theory in here from Audre Lorde and my fellow feminists, using the master's tools to undo these oppressive systems that become institutional. And I think that one can do that respectfully, mindfully, and connecting with folks that brought you into the institution. If you're there, you went through the application process, you crossed every hurdle, and they might not know of your particular differences and having to establish some institutional measures. And so then being courteous and respectful holding folks accountable in the sense of I identify these unmet student needs, and here are some potential solutions that we have thought about and bring to the table. And now you have not only identifying some problems, but you're also providing some way to resolve this matter. And I've seen that in administrative posts, if folks hear more than just I'm demanding this and speaking it with a picket sign, which I have nothing against that, but I think that some folks also have to sophisticate methods, is by saying, well, here's the different modality and how I'm bringing awareness into this issue, and here's what we can do about that in a courteous manner. Because I think at the end of the day, what we might lose track of is that we are in institutions where if we were to just suspend for a minute being undocumented, having limitations of financial aid or work authorization, if you just had all of that at your disposal, say that there were institutional policies that allow you to work and that allow you to pay for your studies, what would you do? Like, what would you bring to the table in terms of research, in terms of your critical analysis? And I think that we can't lose track of that despite having to do some of this work. And so then bringing your best self forward with administrators and setting the bar high of saying, like, there's this problem, there's these solutions, this is what I contribute, very independent from those limitations that we embody everywhere we go. I think that's one way to do that.
Thank you, Juan. And Charlene, if you want to hit on this piece too before you go into your question, that would be great.
Yeah, I think just echoing what Juan said, I think knowing when to be strategic versus knowing when to, pick a fence. And I think, like you mentioned, if you try those strategies, like going to administrators and coming up with solutions, because that's what they want for you to basically do their work for them. So if you do that and they still are hesitant or adamant about it, I think then that's a safe time to resort to community organizing and protesting and getting political. And I think just going back to your question of how do we maintain solidarity, I think something that was so instrumental and again helped me so much in my organizing was people who came before me, and they were intentional in their organizing because they were intentional about unpacking their anti-Blackness and unpacking how their subconscious anti-Black ways can impact their organizing. And we all participate in anti-Blackness, but I think that's something that a lot of people don't discuss when it comes to organizing work, even if you're not Black yourself. But that's something they experience organizing, especially at UC Irvine, surrounding resources for undocumented students, even though I was the only Black person, undocumented Black person visible in this space. I happened to be non-DACA. And again, the resources that I advocated for and ended up leaving when I graduated are gonna benefit so many people who are not undocu-Black. So just thinking about how even the infrastructure that does exist in a lot of campuses, a lot of Black students lay the foundation, and then now other students are able to now benefit off of it by looking at the replication of like, oh, that's what Black students is, so this is what they did. And that's why I think it's important to build solidarity with not only Black students in your campuses, but also with the African American department, with deconstructing your understanding of anti-Blackness, because I think when you do that and you come into organizing, you come from it in a lens of prioritizing the most marginalized group within that space. And that's not something that was happening in my organizing. People were just thinking about DACA, and nobody was thinking about, well, what about people who don't have DACA? What about undocumented Black people? Where are the undocumented PI people? We don't see them in these spaces. Like, what's going on? So, and they say that too often, because when I think back on my college experience, like, I don't think I would have gone as hard organizing if I had DACA, and that's an honest truth I had to come to myself. It's like, when you are not disadvantaged and impacted in that way, it doesn't hit the same. So you don't have that same sense of urgency, And so for me, I had a lot of resentment with my colleagues not investing in the same capacity, because they had DACA. But when it came to the undocumented graduation or Immigration Awareness Week, everybody's on board and ready to support and do all these things. So it just helped me understand how everything is racialized in this country, including immigration. And so that means when you're organizing surrounding immigration, you have to center undocumented Black people. And if they're not in your spaces, thinking about, well, why are they not in my spaces? It's probably because a lot of them are in detention. A lot of majority of Black people are stuck in detention. And if they are fortunate enough to be able to even move within the country, within the limitations, the higher risk of being deported already makes them less likely to disclose their status and to communicate that with you. But even thinking about Black students and all across the country and the different organizing that they've done, and even to date, how they're still the most marginalized, most disadvantaged, but they still continue to organize. And the reason a lot of their organizing work is so instrumental is because they sustain that within each class. So as people are graduating, they transfer the knowledge, they make sure that people are aware of what came before them. And I think that was so helpful for me, is understanding that prior to me coming to UC Irvine, there was a lot of advocacy happening to even get that coordinator. Because remember I said there was a coordinator my freshman year, but for her to even be there, it's because of those upperclassmen who influenced me, who advocated so hard that there was at least a coordinator when I was a freshman. But that could have easily not been the case if they were not politicized enough to understand that, oh my goodness, like I may not benefit from this resource, but at least I know students who are coming in wouldn't have to worry about this. So a lot of it requires being selfless and being vulnerable and being intentional about your own biases and really interrogating, like, why do I not care about other issues on campus? Like, why do I not support the Black students? Why am I not supporting like Students for Justice in Palestine? Like, these are a lot of different coalitions that we engaged in a lot. And that was really helpful in unpacking our own biases as undocumented students and being better leaders. But also, whenever anything went down, we were able now to contact Students for Justice in Palestine. And their co-chairs would come through and be like, hey, undocumented students need our help. Like, we need to show up for them. Or contact BSU, like, hey, I need to go to a meeting with this person. Like, can you guys show up for me? And that way the administrators know, like, oh my goodness, like it's a student coalition. Like these people are connected, they're not isolated. And that was a hard thing because undocumented students were not really engaging with the Black students on campus, and because there was no Black person, I guess. So I made sure I initiated that. But I think beyond that, helping them understand that the reason that these movements, Black students movements, have been able to sustain themselves for so long is because of political education. And that is so important, and that lacks so much in a lot of organizing spaces. And I think that was definitely so helpful for me in my leadership because I was intentional about taking African American studies as a minor. So I learned at least the basics of racial consciousness and what that means and like what that looks like for me. So I encourage other people to do that. Even if you're not Black yourself, even if you're not involved in organizing spaces, understanding how you are racialized to see Black people, view Black people, is important because ultimately Black liberation is liberation for everyone. So if you're already supporting the Black students within your campuses and trying to find ways of similarities and commonalities, you're going to get resources for all students. And I think that's the most painful part, is knowing like, oh, all these people benefit from all these resources that I advocated for, but what about the undocumented Black students? Like, I don't know if they'll ever be able to even get into the institution to take advantage of these resources. But yes, I said a lot.
Oh no, that was absolutely needed. You did not say a lot, you said just enough. So thank you so much for that. And for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about the manner in which undocumented and Black people are disproportionately impacted by immigration, I urge you to think of organizations like the Haitian Bridge Alliance led by Gerline Joseph. I urge you to think about the African Bureau, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, because exactly, Gabriella, injustice anywhere is really a threat to justice everywhere, right? So we have to be intentional about not just advocating for self, because a lot of times institutions will tell us that the reason why we don't have X amount of money is because that org has it, right? But if we pool together resources and we came together to lend to one another, then we really wouldn't have to worry about those deficits. So one thing that I think Charlene's incredible points led to is my question of, how does your identity, how does your experience within education and navigating it as individuals really impact the gaps that you're now filling in this sector, right? So you all are representing this sector, the education sector. So how has your identity, your lived experiences impacted the work that you're now doing within this sector? And we could start with Juan.
Okay, thank you for the question. I've attempted to produce critical analysis of my lived experience in different forms. In my master's thesis, I tried to talk about this tension of being undocumented in academia and being privileged to a great extent, and also being very the feelings of being undocumented, just being very relatable, where if I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time, I could be deported, right? And so then this tension of being in this in-betweenness, I try to conceptualize that through critical analysis more so than just showcasing like, this is what it's like to be undocumented and dwell in existential despair. It was more like, what can living from this standpoint produce theoretically to think through how other identity groups that I'm in relation with might experience the same sort of institutional racism or institutionalized ways of oppressing folks independent of their identity groups. So conceptually, theoretically, like I've used my lived experience to think of that way of producing knowledge. In terms of more practical approaches to the workshops that I do, I'm very open of being undocumented across campus, because to the great degree of privilege that we have at the institution and protection, that I know other folks are new to the institution. Maybe they're undergraduate students who just graduated high school and they're starting off their first year and they haven't been through what I've been through to know that I could be open on their behalf, right? Even though I respect their particular walk of life, which will be different than mine. It's like I could be open. I could talk to folks and say, if you ever need an undocumented student to speak to, if you need me to instruct you on these things through a workshop or whatever, like I'm very intentional of making my identity open and centering the work that I do, whether it be applying to grad school or launching a business, from the undocumented perspective. Like I tailor the services that I do for undocumented folks. And like a call for conference on theorizing undocumentedness, it's for and by undocumented folks. Like those are some of the projects that I'm doing now. And some of the other work that I do in my research is like looking at some frameworks of, for example, Black geographies. Like there's beautiful work there that unpacks and centers Blackness as a category of analysis from a geography and place and setting, and these things that are so amazing that I think that undocumented folks, Latinx folks, people of color, we can relate to these frameworks, but we don't have that sort of theorization just yet. And so my work tries to read relationally with other identity groups and establish coalitions, more on like centering like, why are we both oppressed in a certain way, instead of just siloing each other into identity groups. So I think that that is some of my research that I try to bridge some of those gaps that we might see, but very centered on being undocumented all the time.
That's beautiful one. I love the wanting to create the terminology, but the conversation and the space where we're able to have language that describes our collective experience. So thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing in that. Charlene, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, I had to be the representation. I didn't have an undergrad, and that's essentially what ended up happening post-grad, with doing a lot of speaking engagements, workshop presentations, and working with the Black immigrant organization. Now I have more of an experience of the state of Black immigrants in this country and what that looks like. But I think what was a project that was really instrumental that I actually did with Immigrants Rising was producing a guide on how we can better support undocumented Black students within the higher education. And that was really helpful because the only reason that I was even approached to do that work is because of my extensive organizing background, which is something that I didn't think would come back full circle. But it was a beautiful experience because we had to do focus groups with both educators and undocumented Black students to better gauge their needs and some of the solutions that would be helpful to better support them. And I think what was beautiful is meeting different undocumented Black students from all over the nation, but also reminiscing my undergrad experience because they were the only ones in their own spaces. Like they were the only ones that they knew. So that recollection of the isolation of having that undocumented Black identity, just the reminder of the hyper invisibility that comes with being undocumented Black because you're not viewed as Black, but there's still a hyper visibility of the criminalization because you're still 3 times more likely to be detained and deported, even though you're not viewed as undocumented. And really interrogating that, this is coming from anti-Blackness because your Blackness is why you end up getting arrested in the first place and end up in the deportation system. But it was just so beautiful because I think for all of those people who participate in the focus groups, that was their first time having space to just share about being undocumented Black. Like they had never had space to just release, like the experiences, the challenges, the isolation, being in the shadows, not knowing who to tell, the hyper pressure of being really good academically or being really good in terms of sports, because that's like the only way that you can make sure that, you get a scholarship to go to school and all these other things. So it was really beautiful because it reminded me that I had the courage, and that's why this was all happening, because for a lot of them, they were in different spaces in their undocumented empowerment. Like I forget, because I'm always, I'm undocumented Black, I'm undocumented, I'm undocumented. I'm so used to it because again, the foundation of my college experience was so helpful by having that community resource that I forget other people are not even comfortable saying they're undocumented. So I have to catch myself. And it was doing that space sharing that with them that I realized just how we're all such on different journeys, on such different experiences, because you could be in a completely different state that I don't know how to best advise you, but just that shared community of like, I'm not alone. Like there's other people out there who are like me, like, and they're still grinding, they're still trying to go to graduate school as non-DACA, which is really difficult to do. Like Juan was mentioning, having to figure out how to get your own funding if you're doing a PhD program, especially if your schools don't have discretionary funds. And even though I'm not planning on going to graduate school, but it was just really encouraging to know that people are still resilient, especially within the undocumented Black context, of knowing that you are probably the only person on that campus, and you have to be very cautious about who you even disclose your status to. So it's just so much fear. And then if there is undocumented spaces, then you stick out like a sore thumb and you're able to express your undocumented identity, but not your Black identity, because that's just a disconnect for undocumented folk. We're not Black. And then when you're in Black spaces, you can, bask in your Blackness, but then there's also a limitation in talking about your undocumented experience, because that's something that, a lot of Black spaces are just not used to centering and having space for. So I think it just reminded me like, oh my goodness, it's a big deal that I graduated as an undocumented person without DACA, and just how like powerful that is. And that just was a self-actualizing moment, because again, I did all this organizing in undergrad, and then now it was coming full circle to where I was holding space for other undocumented Black students to share their experiences. And the guide is available on Immigrants Rising website. I encourage you all to check it out. But I think it just reminded me of just how big the gap is for undocumented Black students. And that's something that my business offers to do, just being that representation, because I am my business. And again, it's like I had to do that because there's no other undocumented Black people. There's not enough of us who are visible in the mainstream to share about our plights, about our struggles, about our experiences. So like I have to do that for other people, because one, I'm already comfortable in my identity and I'm secure in it, but also understanding because we are very limited. So there's no space for just being invisible.
I felt absolutely everything. And I specifically related to the statement about you just coming to terms with how much you had to navigate. I think oftentimes we're stuck in survival mode, that we don't even really have the time to grapple with everything that we've been traumatized by, right? So in you saying that, it literally took me back. I'm like, oh my gosh, we are survivors for even having gotten it this far. And you too, Juan, you too, Rocio, right? You shared your journeys. You shared being at UC Santa Cruz and like what that meant for your journey. We are all survivors for having made it this far, and now being privileged enough to be in a space like this where we could share with other scholars who are currently navigating these things and say, wait a minute, you can overcome those obstacles too. And I think that's why this audience needed to hear from you two in particular, from the non-DACA perspective. We could have easily had documented folk, right? But it says something, especially within education. And Charlene, you said this earlier. You said that the time in which you navigated being in higher ed, the concentration was focused upon documented individuals. And now the reality of the education sector that we're navigating, the vast majority of folks who are graduating are doing so without DACA. And we don't have anything coming up the pipeline. So what my question to you is, how have you been able to successfully, and I think Juan, you touched on this with the creation of like your own LLC, how have you really solidified this work, your story, your contributions, and fortified it no matter what happens in regard to policy? So this is going to be my last question, and then I want the audience to prepare their own questions. I see some already in the Q&A box, but I want you all to add some more so that we could hear from you. But that's going to be my last question before we hand it over.
You have all these great questions through this panel. I don't like when folks say that we find the loopholes, because it kind of makes it feel like we're doing something out of line. When I think that being undocumented in this country, being able to develop a business venture, pay taxes, work, if not as an employee, but as an independent contractor, attend graduate school, professional school, practice law while undocumented, obtain an employer identification number once you have a business, and hire folks that have work authorization. When you don't have it, that's not a loophole. It's by design. And so then when you know that these things are set up in a particular way by some folks, and that you have been admitted to an institution and you didn't go through the back door, you applied the same way, or you paid taxes the same way, you set up a business the same way, it's by design. And we tend to forget that. And I think that or we might not see it as such, right? I think that embracing that reality of like, this is out there and you're not doing anything wrong, allows one to continue doing what one is doing with pride and with dignity and with decency, of being able to say, I'm not finding a loophole. Like, there's a place for me that I am occupying. I found my niche. It's set up in a particular way. And that could be very empowering. Although I know that some folks might have this idealized version of like, I want to have access to employment and retirement and benefits, and all these things are great. I'm not saying they're not, but also being an entrepreneur and paving your way, having an opportunity to pitch a project, folks believe in you and give you all of this support and resources, that could be very empowering. And you could be doing something that no one else is doing, very much like the work Charlene is doing. Like, no, who is doing that work? And we need it, right? And I think that's my answer to you. Like, once you come to the determination that it's not a loophole, it's by design, and you could embrace that, it empowers you in a different way.
We are not going through the back door. We are entering the same way and having navigated as many things as we have. Thank you for that affirmation, Juan.
Mm.
Charlene?
What was the question? I forgot, sorry.
No, no problem. So the question was about how did you fortify your presence, your existence within this space, right? Like given this sector, given the work that you're doing, Juan was able to create LLC around it, as well as is working to develop various theories to be able to explain the classifications of our community. Is like, what are some things that you, Charlene, is actively doing to make sure that in spite of policy, you will continue to thrive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, and I think for me, because my getting into business was very, non-conventional. It's not like a conventional business like other people, because it's me providing my own services of my knowledge and expertise on Black immigration and presenting on it. So I often forget, like, oh my God, yeah, I do have a business. It's just because it's me. But I think for me, like, because I know this is the situation we're limited to, but really thinking beyond that, like thinking about how can we mobilize nationwide within the state to create opportunities that don't involve having to open a business, because I think that's something that I romanticize so much, especially not really having any other options. But it's not something that I would choose for myself. Like if I could opt out of it, I would not have chosen that route. It was just out of necessity and survival. And I think that's just something I want to leave with, is just being very intentional about that process, really thinking about why you're opening up a business. Like if it's outside of you genuinely being passionate about it and it's more for survival, really interrogating, like, is this the most absolutely necessary thing I have to do? Because if you can navigate just using an ITIN or just, without having to open a business, I would encourage it, because there's a lot of financial incurrences that come with managing a business and sustaining it until you're even able to make profit. And I think at the time when I was doing it, I was just doing it out of like, because the job I got, it took 3 months before I even got my business established and set up. So for that period of time, they were waiting on me like, oh, like, when are we going to get started? What's going on? So it was just a very daunting and frustrating process. And I think for me, it just reminded me of how limiting it is to have to be reduced to documentation and status and papers, and all these things. So I think more than anything, we need to be working towards a more inclusive way outside of business ownership that will benefit everyone, because not everyone can open a business. That's not sustainable. But I think in the meantime, if that's something that you have to do and you really like, that's the only way you can survive legally, by making sure that you're paying your taxes, is really interrogating, like, how can you make sure that you already align with people who are doing work similar to that or doing that kind of work, to understand the scope and the challenges that may present themselves when the time comes. So I think for me, that would be the main thing. Because for me, I understand that I can work without my business. It's just something that is beneficial for me to have if I have to, if I'm working with a company that requires me to pay my business directly instead of paying me directly. But for me, it's actually something that I would opt out of if I didn't have to, because now I have to worry about personal taxes and business taxes. So I don't say that in a way of discouraging people from opening businesses. I just say that in a way of being intentional about, do I absolutely have to do this? And then if you do, trying to understand the scopes of the challenges that might come with that. So at least when you encounter them, they don't catch you off guard, because for me, I was like, oh my God, I have to pay business taxes, my own personal taxes. I still have to do quarterly financial reports when I'm not even making any income. Like, what is going on? And again, these were things I didn't conceptualize, because in the moment I was in an urgent state of like, I need to start working. So I think now that I'm more aware and cautious of it, I would just be more intentional before getting into that process, by communicating with people who are already going through it, who are aligned in the same field. And also knowing that business ownership is not the only way to get your idea off the ground or to be able to do what you're passionate about or what you love. There are other avenues, and really thinking about how can you explore those avenues before you get to business ownership. I know that's not the answer most people wanted to hear, but I think it's really important, because a lot of times we don't talk about the challenges of business ownership. We romanticize it so much, and I understand, because it's a band-aid solution to being undocumented and being without status. But how can we now start mobilizing as community members to create those fellowships outside of just school? And I think that's something, at least within the UC system, they're trying to do it UC wide. So if it happens UC wide, it can happen statewide. Like, We need to be thinking more long-term because not everyone will be able to open a business is what I'm saying. But in the meantime, if that's a temporary solution, then just being intentional about, is this absolutely necessary for me? Or are there other avenues where I can still legally make money, like just independent contracting? Because you can still at least just do independent contracting, and that way you still don't have to pay business finances, incur business fees, have money to open up your business. So just being intentional is key. But if you're somebody who already knows, I have this idea, I love it, I want to do this, align yourself with people who already know what that's like, so you have an understanding. Because I did not understand the scope of what it would mean, and I wish I knew. So that's what my takeaway.
And that's not negative at all, right? Like, I think that's important for folks to go in knowing exactly what they might encounter. A lot of folks go in blind, right? And unfortunately really set themselves up for failure from the beginning. Whereas you're telling folks, be intentional, but also do your due diligence, and then find out who are going to be the people who are going to support you, right? One thing that came up during last week's Meet the Immigrant Entrepreneur was the importance of having individuals within your own orbit who could do certain things, right? The point of this work is to make sure that we're putting on community, that we're putting on family, we're putting on friends. I know people say nepotism is a bad thing, honey, but there's no way I'm struggling for free just to struggle. Like, if I'm going to struggle, it's at least to create a pathway to make someone else's life easier at minimum, you know? And so I think that that's the key, right? Being able to start by power mapping our own groups of people, seeing who we have that's able to make certain aspects of our life easier. And then one thing that I wish I would have done too is be unafraid to ask questions, right? Like, you should always go into every area of life like a confident white cisgendered man who has all the confidence in the world to go and ask for six figures in spite of not having the qualifications to do so. So if they could go in and ask for things based upon no qualifications, then you absolutely should be able to be a testament to your own work and efforts and say that I can do it, right? So never allow anyone to place limitations upon you and what you're able to achieve is the moral of the story. And then be confident in your own circle to be able to catapult you to where you need to be. So thank you both Charlene and Juan for that. And then now I really want to open it up based on the questions that I see from the audience. I think one of the biggest ones that came up came from Maria Carizales. And Maria asked, how do you identify the right people when advocating for yourself? And I think that's a huge one, right? Because there's a lot of folks who will pretend to be an ally and will pretend to be down for the cause. And when it's all said and done, it doesn't necessarily end up that way. So whoever would like to take that question, if you both want to take it, great.
Charlene, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I can go first. I have a quick answer for me. Because that was my experience in opening my business. So for me, it was actually my relationship with my African American Studies professor, who I told, like, oh my goodness, I got this job, but I have to open up a business so that way they can pay me business as a business. I'm navigating this process. It's really tedious. And she knew somebody within her circle who manages other people's businesses. She's helped them open businesses. So she was already familiar with the process. And she connected me to her. And that's kind of how at least I was able to navigate that process, because she at least knew the logistics of it. But when I think about that relationship, because it was just intentionality in terms of me sustaining that relationship with that professor. Like, I would go to her office hours, I'll be intentional about engaging with her beyond the classroom. And that was something that was really instrumental, because once I graduated, she was one of the few professors who checked in on me, like, how are you doing? Are you going to navigate life? Like, what's going on? And I know it's so much harder, especially when you're in STEM, because I was public health science, to connect with the professors, because they can be very off-putting. They just care more about their research, as opposed to humanities, who are more engaged, or social sciences, they're just more like intentional about building community. But I think you have to go out of your way to create those networks. And again, being strategic about them. So like I mentioned how the fellowship I did was in the School of Medicine, and I was trying to go to medical school, and building those relationships within that office. So at least if I were to apply, they would remember who I was. But for me, I've only navigated postgrad as an undaca because of those connections, and a lot of them came from my community building and organizing work. And this is why I encourage a lot of students, please get involved, please get involved, please get involved, because for me, like college for me was where I came into my identity of self. It's really where I got empowered about who I am as a Black woman in this country, specifically being undocumented and Black. So it was really instrumental, but it's because I sought those spaces out. I went into the Black Student Union. I went to the undocumented student groups to learn about like, how can I better understand my identity? How can I better navigate college? And those were instrumental because those spaces where I met different people who now post-grad, when I was staying in touch with them, was like, oh my God, I actually know somebody who I can connect you with. Let me see what I can do. Because if I hadn't had that business advisor, like, I don't even know if I would have opened my business. It was such a daunting process. I was so naive and going to the idea. I remember I did check out Immigrants Rising because I know they have resources on like different businesses and what they are. So that was helpful for the foundation, but actually doing it is a completely different process in itself. And for me, it was because of the intentional socializing and maintaining of those friendships. So just community building can take you really, really far. So I just really, really encourage that. Even within your own friendships, you don't know who may know who. So don't also forget to tap into your own circles, because I think a lot of times we limit our own resources and who we may know, or like how we may help each other. So even before you go to a professor or administrator, even look within your own circles, like, hey, do you know somebody who's been through this? Do you know any administrator who can help me with this, or X, Y, and Z? And also like, again, being involved with the community, because I invited a lot of community members for different speaking engagements. And that's how I ended up getting my first job post-grad. It was one of the communities that I invited to speak. We're like, oh my goodness, you know, we like the work that you do. Like, and once I graduated, they reached out to me. So a lot of my opportunities just came from networking. And a lot of that time when I was networking, I wasn't really thinking about it. It was just out of community building and organizing, but they ended up being super beneficial. So that is a main thing that I would really share. Just network with as many people as you can and sustain those relationships even post-grad.
Absolutely. That college network, I don't think there's anything like it. Charlene, you're absolutely right. 7 years later, I don't want to age myself or anything, but years later, I'm still connected to a lot of those same folks. And much like you, those are the people who continue to invite me to their campuses, to their colleges, to their universities to speak to their student population. So absolutely, that network is going to be crucial for life. Another question that I saw is from Gabriella. And Gabriella, shout out to you, honey. You've been leading this chat, okay? So Gabriella has a very specific question in regard to wanting to start her own Christian home daycare after graduation. Does anyone have experiences with launching something like this? So I know that, you know, these particular group of folks might not have expertise in navigating that particular business, but I think what would be helpful is if Juan and Charlene, if you all could share about some resources that helped you. Were there some grant opportunities that you all pursued? Were there specific organizations that you were able to be directed to that supported you? That would be helpful for anyone, no matter what business they're looking for.
Yes, I made great use of the resources through Immigrants Rising. There was the DocuHustle Hub, which later became Spark at Immigrants Rising. I believe the name might have changed, but the resource, the platform of like being able to go from an idea to a full-on like model and work at your own pace, create your own portal, which was confidential. Like that was fascinating, and all of the short snippets of videos that just synthesized what one would have to read in these forms that you have to fill out just so neatly. I made great use of that resource. Outside of Immigrants Rising, one thing that really helped me out a lot, and I think it can help in your venture for the daycare as well, is the Secretary of State of California has a website if you're going to incorporate a business. That's where I had to file my LLC. And they have self-help guided tips. So like you're able to look at questions you might have. It's very easy to navigate. Or if you just pick up the phone and call the Secretary of State office or the virtual assistant, it was odd that it was so accessible to actually file an LLC with them, that it was kind of weird. Like, yeah, you could just call and say, hey, I'm filling this out and I have this question. They're like, yeah, do this. That was weird in a sense, but the Secretary of State I would recommend. And there's another website in California where you're able to input your county, and this is also through the state of California. You're able to enter your county where you reside, the type of business you envision, and then it tells you like what sorts of permits or licenses you have to get in that area, and then it's up to you to follow through. These are all state resources that were very helpful. Not necessarily undocumented focused as is Immigrants Rising, but I was able to like look at both, and they provided great help together. And I
Thank
also
you for that
benefited
one.
from the $5,000 grant from the Sparks at Immigrants Rising when it was offered. So thank you for that.
No problem. This is not a plug for IR, but yes, definitely a resource that you all can always use. What about you, Charlene?
I definitely echo what Juan said, because I definitely had an easier process just because I had somebody to guide me. But Immigrants Rising was really helpful even understanding the different types of businesses like sole proprietorship versus LLC, and knowing which one best serves you and what you're trying to do. And beyond the resources they mentioned, I think you just have to go out of your way to really search like what is available, especially if you're outside of California. So you have to do a lot of different searching, a lot of just going out of your way to search what already is accessible for the field that I'm trying to get into. And that's if you already don't know people who are already within that field, or you don't know somebody who knows somebody. So it gets harder when you don't have those connections, but it's not impossible. It just means it'll be more tedious and more work on you to find what exists, since you don't already know what that looks like. But I hope that doesn't discourage you from the process, like please keep at it, and just try and connect with the people who may know somebody who's gone through that process, who has a similar business model, because I know different businesses have different requirements as well. But yeah, just be intentional. I think intentionality about being relentless in your search and pursuits is really, really helpful, because you just never know what resource might come up, in that search. That's really what I would have to say. I know it's not much.
You're on mute, Danae.
Thank you. I was wondering, I'm like, wait a minute. All right. So one of the biggest questions that Angela asked was around the resources that I was putting in the chat. So one of the biggest resource that helps not just immigrants, but everyone is SBDC. So the Small Business Development Center, also the Small Business Association. So even though they're not specifically tailored toward undocu-specific things, they do provide you with a free coach, right? That's able to assist you no matter what your status is. And that person can help you find out what you would be eligible for. And another great thing about that website is that once you type in, and I think Gabby made this point too, that once you point out your zip code, it will guide you to specific resources on the ground that supports you in your state or in your county. So that's what you'll need. And then also over at Immigrants Rising, of course, we do have a list of opportunities that's not just for the state of California, but for other places as well too. But it's always good to look and find out what local immigrant rights organizations that there are. And I would urge you to look into what your city is doing and what your county is doing. So here in California, specifically LA City and LA County, they just had a grant opportunity that was open for all Angelinos, no matter what their status was, to be able to apply. And what I would urge you to do is to be able to advocate for yourself. Never take no for an answer. If you look at an application, so for me, I'm the biggest person who's like, that ain't gonna work. You say no, I'm like, that's not working. What are we doing aside from no? And so if you see an application come across that you check every single box except for being, someone of status. That's the only thing that separates you. I think Juan said this earlier. Charlene echoed the same sentiments. folks don't know what they don't know. So if they're closing off a sector of their application simply because you're not a citizen, that's ridiculous. It's 2023, about to be 2024. Ask them why that is. Are they going to be able to compensate you because you meet each other criteria to do it? Ask those questions, push them as to why they're completely eradicating a certain group of people simply based on status in this day and age, right? So never feel a certain way in having to reach out directly to the person that's running the application or the person that's managing it, so that you could see if the opportunity could be open to you as well too. So never take no for an answer. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all. If you all could choose one word that you want to pass on to encourage these students, or maybe one sentence, what would be the sentence that you want to leave the scholars with? Charlene?
Was a relief sentence. Okay, let me remember it. Because I said it before and it was really beautiful. But I think something along the lines of, despite my positionality as an undocumented Black woman, I am hopeful in the autonomy I have individually. So despite the circumstances that are presented around me, I still have agency in how I respond to my circumstances. So really remembering that, because a lot of times you're so put in a corner where you feel like, oh my God, I have no way out. I can't go to medical school because I don't have DACA, which was my case, but I was still persevering and like, I don't know how, but let me still get the requirements ready. Let me still make sure I have the fellowship just in case the opportunity presents itself. So if you want something bad enough and there's no pathway right now for you to happen, like keep at it, because you don't know when that pathway might open up. You don't know who may know somebody who can help make that dream come true. And I truly believe deep down, like if it's something that is meant for you, it will find you. It may take hurdles and be a roller coaster ride, but it will find you. So if you know deeply that this is something you want to do, this is something you want to venture out into, just be resilient in that pursuit. And like Dene mentioned, I think she said it a lot of times, don't let your circumstances limit you. How you choose to respond to it dictates a lot about where you go in life. Yeah.
Absolutely. Charlene, I'm going to need that for my Twitter, or should I say X later. Thank you. Juan, how about you?
It's hard to go after that because I share that sentiment. I don't know, folks. I want to say something like, do what you want, you're gonna do it anyway. Like I read that somewhere. and I know there's limitations, there's roadblocks, there's things we're gonna have to hurdle over, but don't be afraid to reach out to folks who have done it and are willing to hear you, give you some advice. But I would probably just stress the fact that if even just like a thought experiment, if undocumented was not a thing, what would you be doing? Like how would you employ your energy in speaking beauty into the world? Is it through education? Is it through entrepreneurship? Like that's what I mean by do what you want, because you're going to do it anyway. If it's going to make you feel happy, suspend the liminality of being undocumented and just think, if I had that fellowship, if I had that, I don't know, opportunity to go to grad school or launch a business, what would I be doing? And try to attain that. There's ways to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Charlene. This has been amazing, and I'm sure the scholars enjoyed deeply what you all were able to share. So thank you so much for that and for your time. And now I want to hand it back to my colleague, Rocio.
Thank you, Danae. Thank you, Charlene, Juan. This was such an inspirational panel, and there was such a wealth of information that was shared here today. And I do want to ask the audience to share. I know this is going to be very hard to share. What is one word takeaway from today's panel session? And I know, like I went ahead and I shared in the chat the mentee link for you to share that one word in that one takeaway. I'm also going to be sharing the website and the QR code for you to share. And I am leaving inspired by all of this wealth of information. And one of the things that really stood out is that you don't necessarily need to know everything. It is not always what you know, but it is who you know. And there is also a level of responsibility of continuing to educate ourselves, whether it's in a classroom or outside of the classroom. And we also have a responsibility of educating others. And there is within the process of educating others an opportunity to make money as well, if you're able to identify that need. So in that journey of educating yourself, educating others, there can be opportunities where you yourself can benefit from that process, whether it's financially or whether it's expanding your knowledge, your skills, or whether it is building that network of people that will get you to where you're at. And so I, again, am very grateful for you, Charlene and Juan, for coming in and as your most authentic selves and really showing up as the full version of yourself with all of the different complexities that come with your identity and with the identities that I'm pretty sure other people were able to relate. And so, again, we want to have you share your one-word takeaway. This is something that we are going to be compiling and sharing with other people so that we can have this information available, because it is going to be inspiring for others as well as we go through that process. And again, this is a quick reminder that we are going to have our series once again on Friday, November 10th. With another group of panelists. And so the recording will be available for you to check out. And thank you all so much for being here with us and for everything that you went ahead and shared today.